Thank you, Bill. Oh, that's all good then. Yeah. We made a stop on the way over here, and there was this van parked near us, and it had a sign on the back, handmade, and it said, "Relax, nothing is under control."
It's just what we needed to hear.
And then, I don't know if I should say this at Unity, but then it had a bumper sticker that said, "Join the dark side. We have cookies." Oh my goodness. Once again, here we are. Once again, we stand on the threshold of January, a month named for Janus, the Roman god of beginnings and transitions, the god that presides over doorways. Did you know that? In January, we step across a threshold. You may find it interesting, although perhaps of little practical use, to learn that January is oatmeal month, hot tea month, National Soup Month, and National Codependency Awareness Month.
Now that I did not know.
Not sure how that relates to these hot foods, but however we celebrate it, entering a new year, we step through a portal into the unknown. Now, those of us who've been around the block a little bit may easily feel something like this. I've been through all this before. I've tried resolutions. They didn't change anything. I didn't transform my waistline or restore my hairline. I didn't increase my income, build my abs, or start an exciting new career. The exercise equipment I bought, I later sold at a yard sale at a loss. I didn't find romance or learn Chinese or become a gourmet chef. I'm fixing the same old meals, loading them into the same old body, and feeling the same old dissatisfaction on June 1st that I felt on December 31st. So what's the point? Mm-hmm. Do you make any New Year's resolutions? I make only one, really, and that's in part what I came to talk about. But first, December 25th, just passed, marks a day when a child was born who, by the time he was in his 30s, brought forth ideas that would revolutionize our thinking and transform the world. I refer, of course, to Isaac Newton, born December 25th, 1642. You knew that. We're all familiar with Isaac Newton, but what do we know about John Newton? Let me tell you about him. John Newton was born in London in 1725. His mother died before he turned 7. He was sent first to a boarding school, then to live with his father's new wife. You know, guys wore out wives in those days, right? A lot of stories of remarrying. His father was a shipmaster, and at age 11, Newton went to sea to join his dad. When his father retired a few years later, Newton found work on a merchant vessel in the Mediterranean. At 18, don't worry, I'll summarize all this later. At 18, he was pressed into service very much against his will in the British Royal Navy. He tried to desert and was punished with 8 dozen lashes. That's a lot of lashes. A new chapter opened in Newton's life when he was transferred to a slave ship bound for West Africa. Now, at this point, Newton was a troublemaker. He was a troubled kid turned into a troubled young adult. He was a real hellion aboard any vessel, a cynic who tried to disabuse any peers, of the faith they possessed. We have a saying, don't we? Someone swears like a sailor. In a culture that gave birth to this cliche, Newton was disciplined multiple times, not only for using the worst words the captain had ever heard, but for creating new ones that exceeded the limits of verbal debauchery. I will not quote any. Yeah. In all, he was not popular on this vessel. And in Sierra Leone, the captain just offloaded Newton to a slave dealer who made him a household slave to his wife. At last, Newton, in his early 20s, was rescued by a ship's captain his father had sent to find him, and he began a voyage back to the British Isles. Do you suppose all then went well and he lived happily ever after? No contraire. That ship foundered in a violent storm off the coast of Ireland. Newton in the hold is said to have called out to God for mercy, and just then saw some cargo shift and cover a gaping hole in the ship's side, allowing it to make landfall. He later recorded the date, March 10th, 1748, as the beginning of his conversion to a religious life. But this conversion clearly proceeded in stages, or like a lot of guys, he was just good at compartmentalizing, for he continued, even with his newfound faith, to work in the slave trade for 6 more years. After that time elapsed, though, Newton retired from sea, having suffered a stroke. He was 29 years old. Let us review, if we may, Mr. Newton's life so far. Mother dies when he's 7, goes to boarding school, lives with a stepmother, then works in the Merchant Marine Service from age 11, as so many of us have. Forced to join the British Royal Navy at 18, disciplined with 96 lashes, sounds a tad excessive, becomes a slave, almost dies in a raging storm, has a stroke at 29. It sounds like a bit too much was packed into one man's life. Maybe people lived faster in those days. Now, why are we even talking about this old English fellow who had a faith conversion after working in the worldwide slave trade? Because there's a connection to January. Newton, having recovered from his stroke, married his childhood sweetheart, Polly, and now as a fervent Christian began to study on the side so he could enter the ministry. While working as a tax collector, he taught himself Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac in his spare time in order to read the scriptures in the ancient tongues, as so many of us have done at the end of each workday. Well known as a lay minister, it took nearly another decade before he was accepted into the Anglican priesthood and assigned a parish. In 1764, he would have been 39 years old. It's said that Newton's preaching style was different from that of those who had gone to seminary. His messages had an earthy flavor, hopefully not with the old creative swearing, but in other ways. And unlike most ministers of his day, he spoke personally about his struggles. He told stories people could relate to, and his congregation grew and grew. He then formed a partnership with a writer, William Cowper, and together these two men resolved to produce a new poem every week for a prayer meeting that Newton had established. And it was on January 1st, 1773, and here at last is our tie to January. On that day, a poem from Newton was first unveiled to the world. He called it 1 Chronicles 17:16 to 17, Faith's Review and Expectation. Yeah, you don't recognize that brilliant title? Perhaps you would know it by its more common name, Amazing Grace. You know, they say that inventors of stuff never get the names right. Like the person who invented crossword puzzles called them word cross puzzles, just for an example. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, the original language. We now sing saved a soul. Sal and I always do. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Newton preached by telling his own story, his biography, and the song reflects that. He felt he'd been rescued at sea and in his life by an amazing grace. He felt he'd been lost, had been blind, unseeing and uncaring, and now he could see clearly the error of his ways. He went on in the next decade to write and preach about the slave trade and our need to stop this practice. He joined forces with William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament, who spent his career as an abolitionist in the British government. And when Captain Newton came to the end of his life's voyage, it was 1807, the year the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. It was a beginning to the abolition of slavery in the UK. And Newton's writing and ministry were seminal in helping to bring this about. Of course, slavery comes in many forms. In high school, I had a friend, Jim Luce, who was a fervent Pentecostalist. In fact, at just 17, he was essentially a minister to a Pentecostal group. As he said to me, I'm a shepherd to a body of believers. He once told me about one of his flock who he felt was saddled with false beliefs of some kind, saying, I told her, sister, you're in bondage. I feel I know what he meant. One recent Christmas, or if you prefer, a commemoration of Isaac Newton's birthday, we listened to Dickens' A Christmas Carol on the radio as we engaged in an epic Scrabble battle. Sally won, which just isn't fair.
And hardly ever happens.
We heard the part where Scrooge meets Marley's ghost, and he sees that Marley drags a chain with him. You are fettered, says Scrooge. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replies Marley's ghost. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. We fetter ourselves with different chains, our attitudes, our prejudices, our perspectives. We create our life experiences through our way of thinking. Sound familiar? Of the 5 unity principles, that's the key, the hinge point right in the middle. So that when I said earlier that I make only one New Year's resolution, this is what I meant. New Year's resolutions, by and large, don't work. And when we take them on as ways to improve ourselves, to enrich ourselves, to make ourselves do something, they become less vehicles for liberation and more fetters, chains we ourselves forge. And we are then, as my old friend Jim said, in bondage. with each resolution, I'm trying to gain something I have decided is important. A new car or job or body, to clean out my closet, not to swear, or at least not as much as John Newton, to quit getting angry, no more late night snacks. I may have noble intentions, but ultimately there's a component of me. What if my New Year's resolution was, instead of what I will do, what I want, what I intend, all about how now, this day, this year, this moment, this person is going to open themselves to what's directed by the spirit of creation? What if instead of any particular goals, I simply said to God, to Christ, to Spirit, not my will, but thy will be done? What if a New Year's resolution I made was nothing I could later beat myself up about for failing at, or congratulate myself for succeeding with, because it's an ongoing process, opening myself to the guidance of Spirit day by day and moment by moment in 2025 and in the rest of 2024 as well. When I try to unfetter myself, I either don't have the key or I end up filled with pride at how well I'm doing it. Something in my psyche adds a link of chain even as I remove the one I'm working on. It reminds me of what one speaker from Alcoholics Anonymous says. This man, Earl, talks about the point in step work when the person in recovery asks a higher power to remove all their defects of character. And Earl says, I ask God to do it. I can't do it for myself, because if it were up to me, I'd remove the wrong stuff. I'd make deals with God around what I will give up and what I won't. Instead of making deals with Spirit, what if I could just open myself up this year to what Spirit calls me to do, to be? What is my calling this year, this day, this moment? Whatever I think it is right now, what if I set that aside and listen more deeply? Red Green, do we have any Red Green fans? He was on TV for quite a while. Red Green once said on his show that he had felt he had found his calling. And it seemed to be some combination of watching TV, eating junk food, and complaining. So that one's taken. Prem Daya relates. She's like, me too. But what if I could over and over open myself to the voice of Spirit, to what I'm called to do? For my birthday some years ago, I got the most marvelous card from Sally. I keep it on my bedside table and look at it often. It showed a doorway. That's a key word today for January. A doorway opening. And outside that door, there's a brilliant, starry sky. The card said to me what I wish to say to you. Across this threshold, past the place that's familiar to you, outside of your old dwelling, there's a star-filled universe of possibilities. There's an infinite space filled with wonder. There is not only amazing grace, but amazing space. Amazing space, how sweet the sound, the music of the spheres in the heavens wide. Your stars astound, and love overcomes my fears. We may think we know what will unfold in 2025. We may have fears. I imagine there are a few sprinkled here and there. But what if we open ourselves up to the amazing grace and amazing space of the unknown possibilities that Spirit will manifest? No matter what our past. Yeah, I agree. Applauding, really affirming. That's an affirmation out there.
Yes, yes.
You know, we should move this whole thing out to a parking lot so the cars can listen more easily. No matter what our past, there's a grace that redeems us, that makes us useful and able to participate in the flow of divine love. And finally, it occurs to me more and more as I engage with unity churches, which we do throughout the region, that we become year by year a vital, strong, and robust group of like-minded seekers. And the question I have for each of us to consider also is this: what is our mission as a church community? What new missions will we be called to? What can we open ourselves to? A patient of ours in treatment, I work in substance use disorder treatment, said this one day: I already have what many are praying for. Wow. To make that statement from the depths of the reboot, that is hospitalization for substance use disorder, she was right. And perhaps more critically, I believe her words were right on target for me and for us. We are blessed. And as Albert Schweitzer once wrote, we must not treat our lives as being for ourselves alone. Whoever is spared personal pain must feel themselves called to help in diminishing the pain of others. I think in the coming year, there will be no shortage, sadly, of pain. This is nothing new. But there will always be a need for those who are willing to heed the call of Spirit to be beacons of hope and islands of light on a dark sea. Let this be a year when we loose our chains and rise to the voice of Spirit, the amazing grace, the amazing space calls each of us. It is up to us to listen. May we listen well. Amen.